welcome back to our conversation on chips with Daniel Gerstein and Dan Wong. So far, we've talked about supply chains and industrial policy, but let's turn to defense and global stability. So how do chips enable modern weapons from drones to hypersonic missiles? Daniel?
Well, again, we said it at the top of the show. I mean, this is so pervasive now that, all of the capabilities, the advanced capabilities that we're seeing are absolutely, relying on and in need of the chips. And, not just the low end chips either. The more and more advanced chips give you the greater capabilities. And so as we seek to bring in more artificial intelligence, we're going to have to think about the semiconductors that we're going to be using, trying to develop smaller, more capable types of chips. That's going to, cause second and third order effects. We need lots of energy to run the systems. We need assured comm pipes to run the systems for deployed forces. All of our sensors and data processing will rely on that. So it changes the Internet of Things and where the edge actually is and where computing needs to be. So we need to rethink our communications architectures, and all of that relies on semiconductors as well. So, part of that is that competition for military capabilities. There's another piece of this, and that is the competition that is ongoing for this supremacy in chips. And so the US is looking at things like export controls and supply chain diversifications. China's looking at its military civil fusion and its internal subsidies and, developing self-sufficiency. And they're using things like their access to critical minerals. Rare earth metals has become another focal point, which is embedded in chips. And so all of this is saying that it's a very turbulent time for supply chains and developing these military capabilities that are, being unfolded.
Dan?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think also there are two levels to this. On the one level is, kind of every, chips and semiconductors suffusing everything. And to the extent you get the most advanced chips, you're going to provide the best protection. You're going to have the best impact you need, whether it's military applications or broader ones, right? So I think that's kind of one level. But to the extent that we're looking at, kind of the broader competition, if you will, what I see is that there's a broader competition of two very different systems, maybe much more even on the economic side of things. And for example, and I think maybe the big theme today is warfare, if you will. Well, to the extent that, your advantages in war is not just your weapons, it's not just your applications and these being powered by chips, it's also your economic power behind that. And, and if we take a look at that level and we expand let's say the competition to that area, then I really need to think we should take a much more holistic view of the environment of which these chips are used. How do you use a chip to power new types of applications? How do you use these chips to lower your cost? How do you use these chips to bring better productivity overall to your system so that you have the economic might to continue to produce and build different things? And I think, having spent over 14, 15 years living and working in China, and then having lived there after being in the West, you really see a very, very different system. Daniel touched on the part of the system a bit early on, and the system in China is I think often misunderstood in some ways. People call it the state capitalism, and natural focus on the fact that it's all state driven, state funding, state direction. You have the Made in China 2025 plan, and all these things, and I think that's great. That is one area where it's very, very different. That's very deep industrial policy. But if you were to ask me, in terms of the innovations coming out from China, I would say that's just 50% of it. It's just 50%. The rest of that is actually very interesting. It's very much bottoms up innovation. It's a very strange combination of having state-directed approach and funding, which you would then think, and you see in many other places where this movie plays out, it doesn't lead to at least zero innovation. People take the money, it gets wasted, right? And so nothing happens. But that's not what we see in China. And the reason is this. I think consciously or unconsciously, the type of competition within the borders is brutal.
Mm,
So so you have all the provinces
yeah,
competing with one another. And what happens is that what you don't see from the outside is that by the time the national winner emerges, by the time you see a Huawei, all the other thousands of companies that have tried to compete for that position have been competed out.
yeah,
So a little bit of the play, but the whole system is that you have this kind of direction, but actually a big part of it is just pure bottoms up innovation and entrepreneurship that comes in also from the VC community. And it's only when you reach a certain stage of success that actually you're the champion, and then you
mm,
get the additional subsidies, right? So it's a very, very different system than I've seen
yeah,
anywhere else.
yeah. No, you're right. It's a different philosophy to innovation, isn't it? Yeah, yeah,
Can I add one thing on that?
yeah.
I I have always been amazed at watching the Chinese approach to development of different capabilities. What I mean by that is, it's clear the United States has for many years enjoyed an advantage in things such as basic and applied research. But where the Chinese have just done extraordinary things is to take the results of that research and early stage development and actually turn it into commercialized products. And I think that's what Dan's really, in large part, referring to.
Mm,
They have been able, in things like biotech, they have been able to take areas and move them forward. Whereas, we always talk about the valley of death. We do the early research and development, but then getting a commercial entity to pick it up is problematic for us. We allow the market to drive that. And,
mm,
it is amazing the way the Chinese have taken a lot of what we had done on that early stage and move it forward. Now, that's the old China. What we're seeing now is that China is actually starting to do more research and development on its own. They are now leading in IP, in other words, patents. They are leading in the number of scientific and engineering articles. Now, I can't speak to the quality of all those, but it does sort of speak to the idea that they've recognized that they want to also be a leader in the upfront research and early stage development. So this is a really fascinating development that has occurred. And this is really over the last, I don't know, Dan, I would say probably 5 or so years that the Chinese have recognized that. I'd be interested in your thought on that.
Yeah, it is a phase, and it's very true. When China started out, they had no scientific base. They had none of these deeper educational institutions. They didn't have a tradition of research. And so a little by force of that environment, they had to focus on the application. So they take what's already there. And there's lots of, innovation maybe on how you assemble it in different configurations. There's some business model innovation. So I would say the first, let's say, if we take a look at technological development more broadly, the first phase was very much around taking, what existed and just applying it. And many of the big companies, where it's the Huawei's, lots of the big internet companies like the Tencents and the Baidus, that's what they started. They had no investment in research. And I think and it's different in different industries. Then the second phase, maybe 10 years ago, some even earlier, right, some a bit later, there's a realization that that was no longer enough to even compete within China, much less the world. And so companies start to put more investment into research,
mm,
which takes time. And so now we're seeing the second wave of the combination of this, kind of this application orientation, coupled with fundamental research and connecting that in a way and in the speed that, it's rare, I would say, to see elsewhere. But you're very right, it is going into phase. And because of that background, I think naturally we're seeing a little bit of more of that the combination between the research and the application. And then you take a further look, and we're going to a phase where there's now an overinvestment in technology.
mm,
And if you take a look at let's say one metric, which is the percentage of, let's say, your company's revenues or profits applied to research, and you look at companies like Huawei and other these companies, you'll see they're overly weighted on that. And so now I don't know if this is a third phase or not, right? But then there's a deeper phase now in terms of deeper research. One thing that I've noticed in China, kind of during my I guess almost 2 decades there, is that one thing that China does very well is something you call the leapfrog strategy.
Yeah.
First went to China. I'm from the mobile phone industry, right? When I first went to China, China didn't even have fixed phones. And can you imagine the amount of investment and time needed to do fixed phones? So they skipped that generation altogether and they went directly to the mobile phone. And because they did that, lots of the applications during that next wave of internet development were mobile first applications. And so you see a lot of the better mobile first application coming actually from places like China, right? And so you're seeing kind of that quite that different change in terms of the way that happens. And now they're kind of taking that next phase.
It's fascinating. How vulnerable do you think Western militaries are to disruptions in the global chip supply chain, Daniel?
Yeah, here I think we're very vulnerable, and it's being played out now. I mean, I talked a little bit about the tariffs, and that's exacerbated it. But we are at a point where President Xi and President Trump are really butting heads on this question, and it's creating real problems for the supply chain. The United States made decisions about rare earths years ago. We decided as a government we wouldn't subsidize them. We allowed them to compete as just an industry. We didn't recognize them as a critical industry at that point. And it allowed China to have 70% of the rare earths and 90% of the rare earth production. And what that means then is that we are in a space right now where we're very, very vulnerable. And the question is, are we going to shut down our military, or are we going to shut down our economics? If we can't get access to the rare earths. And this isn't just for semiconductors, but semiconductors is certainly a piece of it. But, literally all of our military equipment is really using these types of rare earth materials. The other dependency and concern that we have, obviously, is access to one of the biggest chip manufacturers in the world, certainly of the advanced chips, and that's Taiwan. And so, there's another fissure point where, we have to manage the relationship so as, a military confrontation is in no one's interest. Because we would lose access to the chips. It would do enormous damage, likely to the foundries.
So it's the interdependence, which is almost a double-edged sword. The same global networks that make systems efficient also are making them fragile. And as you said, any disruption in Taiwan or in the mainland Chinese supply chain could kind of really ripple instantly through the Western defense capability. So a very tricky situation. How might AI-driven military systems change like deterrence and decision making in war, Daniel?
Well, this is an interesting question. Deterrence is really a psychological condition. You want to make sure that the other person, the other adversary, your adversary is thinking about this in terms of a cost-benefit equation, and you want to make it as costly as possible so that you don't necessarily have to fight. And so, here we need to think about the sorts of decision-making capabilities we have. How do we signal our intent in ways that will register but not be overly provocative? So when we think about deterrence, one of the ways to do it is to have the ability to mobilize very rapidly to signal your intent that this is an important outcome and you intend to protect that outcome. You could also look at preemptive attacks, but again, attacking is not really something that you want to see occur. I would say more recently, what we've seen is that actors have tended to use cyber as a means to signal that they have a capacity and they're in your network or have the capability to disrupt your critical infrastructure or some other aspect. And so we've seen, many times when adversaries are starting to come together on, and perhaps a kinetic war, that it takes place more or earliest in the cyber domain. In terms of decision making, I mean, the benefit that we are looking toward with artificial intelligence and the advanced semiconductors that support that is being able to sense and synthesize information more rapidly than an adversary, being able to make decisions based on that knowledge, and being able to then act much more rapidly. So all of this says that, the speed of decision, the speed of information, presumably should allow for earlier advantage, earlier action, and that could hopefully both deter, but also, should deterrence fail, put one in a position to have a better outcome.
Yeah. Dan, a question for you. What are some of the most interesting defense innovations that you're seeing that have been driven by AI?
Yeah, that's a really good question. But I would like to maybe add a bit more to what Daniel said,
Yeah.
because I think what he said was quite important in there in terms of deterrent, and the fact that now with better AI, if you will, better AI capabilities, you're able to project and deter more, but then protect more. And I think, like many things, there's always two sides to the coin. And I think just AI itself is indeed still, its very, very core, is still a black box with amazing capabilities. But I think the other side of that equation could be also that once you use this as a tool and you rely on that, this is also a new attack surface, of which I think many experts haven't had experience to know how to protect that properly, right? And so I think kind of they're the two sides of that coin. There's a good reason why nations are focused on building that capability. I don't know, and I don't see as much maybe on the attack surface side of things, right? Which which I think inherently is going to be hard to control, right? So that's kind of going to be the two phases we'll start seeing, I guess, maybe in future phases, right? I think, to your question around kind of, AI used in warfare, right? I mean, one thing that's been very clear just in recent conflict, especially, Ukraine and Russia, right? It's just the nature of warfare and using technology like drones.
Yeah.
And that just changes everything. It changes the whole approach that was taken before in terms of, like heavy infrastructure, big tanks, kind of warships, all that, to a type of warfare now that's completely agile.
Yeah.
A drone, is very low cost. It doesn't even necessarily need to use the top end semiconductors, but then you flood the arena with it, and you start changing the face of what warfare is. And so we're already seeing that part of it. There's always been a lot of talk about then using things like robotics, right? And so kind of that being the new phase of warfare, it goes quite to our discussion today, which is this is all technical capability. This is all hardware with software added on top, to provide the type of technological advantage, right? And so in a way, the human is starting to get out of the equation.
Daniel, anything you want to add?
Well, I'm smiling a little bit because I've actually got a novel coming out in February in the UK and April in the United States, and it's called War Without Humanity. And I actually look at some of these issues, and I think what Dan is saying is right on target. I mean, we are rapidly moving into this area where, we're starting to see non-biological intelligences have capabilities that, we hadn't really considered a possibility. But now with the developments that are occurring, they're being incorporated in more and more ways. You know, when you ask about the innovations in defense and in the military, you know, a lot of people like to go right up to the top about, you know, better intelligence and being able to sense more and understand sooner. But there are some other things that aren't nearly as sexy, and things like predictive maintenance and supply chains that can be optimized. You know, they become, you know, real cost savings. And, you know, we all have problems, you know, with people not necessarily wanting to join the military. Propensity to serve is what we call it. And so, you know, this idea of using robotics and autonomous systems, you know, that is coming whether we like it or not. And so we have to figure out what are the limits that we're going to place on those. And, you know, this AI revolution that we're seeing is really on the front end of this. So I'm not necessarily trying to say that the Terminator is going to occur. You know, the Terminator movie is going to be a reality. But I do think that we're edging closer to many more robots on the battlefield for a variety of purposes. And there'll be some dehumanization of the tasks associated with military operations.
A completely different type of war. Yeah.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah. I'm conscious of the time. So before we wrap up, I'd like to ask each of you if you could offer one piece of advice to global executives navigating this race, what would it be? Dan?
I would say as global executives, you know, you're caught in the crosshairs and in the middle of all this global conflict that have immediate impact into your business. So the only advice is find the best way to be as resilient as possible. I've talked to lots of executives, you know, doing these annual 3-year, 5-year plans now is no longer enough. You need to bring in a lot more scenario analysis on that level. Number two, just even on your use of technology, right? To the extent that that is, as an executive, one of the tools to enhance your competitiveness. And given all the changes, my advice would be make sure you use 2 tech stacks. Make sure you're leveraging the Western tech stack and all the innovation that's coming from that part of the world, but also don't neglect the tech stuff coming from China. And you know, given that many of these things now are open source, it's under your control. So my advice would be make sure you're multi-tech stack as it relates to the application of AI.
Good point. Daniel?
Well, I'd like to take a little different tact. In a former life, I was a soldier, and I have served overseas in combat and peacekeeping operations, humanitarian operations, counterterrorism. It runs the gamut. And I'll just say that when I look at this, it is in no one's interest to mistakenly enter into a war that would destroy the economies of the 2 largest actors. And so, you know, finding a way through this path without having to get into an actual war, some sort of major conflict, would be to the benefit of both the United States and China, but also to the world. I mean, there are great benefits that have come because of the manufacturing capacities and the intellect and research and development of both countries. And so, you know, to the extent that we can manage our way through this, I think that would be in the best global interest.
Indeed, indeed. But what I also take from both of you now, though, is that this technology strategy is also a national strategy, and it's not necessarily about who makes the fastest processor, but it's about can we build the most resilient, trusted, and adaptive systems. And you know, it's not necessarily that one wins, but maybe it's dual systems. But hopefully, yeah, we can still keep the peace and navigate through these very tricky times that we're in right now. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Let's Talk Global Business. We'll be back next time with a focus on a new topic. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Dan, for sharing your insights with us. I think we could have gone on for much, much longer. You can find more content on innovation, the economy, and the full catalogue of this series by visiting our website at conference-board.org. Until next time on Let's Talk Global Business.